guy is a mauler at left tackle. But, Daniel, there is still hopefully going to be a season played in the spring with or without Walker Little. We now know it's without. But the rest of college football seems to be moving on without the Pac-12. We're looking at a situation where 3 power conferences have either begun their season or are set to begin their season within the next couple weeks. The Big Ten is voting on a return to play this week. They could come back as early as mid-October. Meanwhile, the Pac-12 still sitting on the sidelines, no clear plan for the future. How should Stanford fans and Pac-12 fans generally feel about the start of this college football season?
Well, to start off, there is somewhat of a plan. Pac-12 was the first conference to really announce a partnership, and I think that's really promising. But seeing all the other games around college football honestly makes me disappointed and a little bit concerned. Because the bubble is the only system that can work, and college football is not operating in a bubble. College football is putting communities at undue risk, and it's honestly dangerous. Last week, Dr. Leroy Sims, who is the vice president and medical director of the NBA, gave a talk on Zoom over at Stanford, right? This is the person who set up the bubble. What he said in that talk is that you need a bubble. He talked about how one of the primary concerns for the NBA when they set up their season in the bubble in Orlando was how are they going to affect communities. And what they did first is in teams' home markets, they made sure each team was giving out testing. And then when they went to Orlando, they made sure the same thing. They weren't going to be a burden on the community. Now, when we have football in South Bend, Indiana, there's problems. There's going to be a lot of testing issues. There's going to be a lot of outbreaks, all because we decided college football is so important that we're going to prioritize it over the health of communities. I think that's the wrong call. And if I'm a student, if I'm a recruit looking around, I'm going to look to the conference that has a moral compass. Is it disappointing that Stanford and the rest of the Pac-12 isn't playing? Sure. But if I'm going to look around, I want a conference that's going to support me and is going to look out for interest beyond money. And that's why I think Stanford and the Pac-12 are making the right call by talking to doctors.
Daniel, I'm going to address that on 2 points. One, the medical point. Second, the football point. On the medical point, you're obviously right. There's been 88,000 cases on college campuses. That is a lot. Now, college students are not really the ones at risk. We've seen very few hospitalizations of college students. One Brown epidemiologist found in his study that out of 26,000 positive cases, there were 0 hospitalizations of college students. But what you're saying is correct. It's about the surrounding communities. And even if the football team is having to isolate, the general student body is not isolating from the surrounding community. They're contributing to major spreads in a lot of these schools that have gone back to campus in a somewhat normal capacity, including playing college sports like college football. So I agree with you that it's very difficult to say that it's a good thing that college football is playing when we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it is clearly not helping the situation. But from a football side of things, I wish all recruits were as high-minded as you, our wonderful biology major who likes to talk to doctors, probably going to be a doctor himself one day. But I don't think that's what everybody's thinking about. I think people are thinking about how can I get on the field? How can I get myself noticed? How can I get myself the NFL? And you said it earlier, Stanford gets guys to the NFL, and I completely agree with that. It is something that David Shaw has done exceptionally well. That may be the greatest thing about the David Shaw era. But right now, those guys aren't getting the exposure they need. And a guy like Walker Little, who is probably going to be your highest pick anyway, he decided to opt out because who knows what's coming in the spring. And to go further on the football point, if the Big Ten and Pac-12 were linked, I thought that it was all good because you got a Rose Bowl potential. And maybe a few more bowl games below that, like the teams 2 through 6 in each conference faced off in bowl games. You could have something of a normal season. But when you're looking at the Pac-12 being potentially the only power conference to try to play in 2021, my guess is they decide not to play at all. Or it is a significantly different season that's effectively nothing more than like the NFL preseason. And that is a huge bummer. And it does make me think that given the testing capabilities that the Pac-12 has recently announced, maybe they could have waited. Maybe they could have waited to see if the technology could catch up with their aspirations, as it did just shortly after they made that announcement. And if they had waited, perhaps we're seeing college football in the Pac-12 That being said, I think the biggest obstacle is state and local restrictions in California and Oregon that are effectively shutting these teams down regardless of what their campus leaders might want to do.
Yeah, no Pac-12 team currently in those two states would be able to have a season or any sort of practicing going on. So maybe they could have waited, but what is waiting really going to get them? We've talked about this before. And yes, disappointing. I'm sure every recruit wants to be out on the field. And I think to some extent it's going to hurt that they don't get to see the Stanford brand represented on the field and they don't get to see it live. But they weren't going to be able to come visit campus. They weren't going to be able to be on the sidelines. It was going to be different anyways. And now Stanford has its coaches who have a lot more time to recruit face-to-face over Zoom, rather. But to be able to establish those conversations with recruits, there's other stuff going on. Sure, there's going to be a lot of things that they're hurt in, but I don't think we could step aside and put aside the moral aspects of it just because of football, right? There's so much more that's going on. Yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I'm disappointed. I would love to be seeing Stanford football. I would love to be seeing all of the fall sports right now, but I don't know how we could have done it. I really don't see it at all.
I agree that it's hard to see how you can do it, particularly if you're saying how we can do it safely. But there are 20 FBS games played this past weekend, and we're going to be looking at even more than that this weekend. I mean, we got college game day going around the country. The SEC is coming back on September 26th, and it's going to feel like a normal fall again, at least watching on TV. These schools are having fans at games. There's just a very different approach to this virus, which obviously has been incredibly polarizing, even though it's a scientific fact. Turns into a political phenomena. And so we've seen, obviously, different approaches across the country, and that's playing out in the college football era as well, or in the college football arena as well. But I just got to say, it really is a shame that we are seeing other teams play while the Pac-12 is sitting out, if only because I feel like these players, they have to be hurting right now. Because they were doing things right on their end. They were controlling the spread. They were making significant sacrifices in their own life to make a season possible. They were isolating with their team. They weren't going out. For a while, they weren't even seeing each other. And then they had that season robbed from them, and it doesn't look like they're going to get it back anytime soon. And now they got to watch everybody else play on TV. And it just reminds me of how fragmented a structure college sports really is, and how there is no central leadership. And had there been central leadership, this would not be happening. We wouldn't have 3 of the Power 5 conferences playing while the other 2 wait, or eventually 4 and then 1 waits. I mean, it is just showing that the NCAA system is broken. We need a new system to replace it, and it's probably going to be with the Power 5 coalescing, probably adding a few teams along the way, and providing their own leadership apart from the other schools that frankly just don't have the same financial incentives as the big guys.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I just want to address something in the chat. Someone's asking if USC is off the table for recruits knowing their moral compass. And I can't speak to anything going on at USC, but I can talk to Stanford's moral compass. And what we saw today is that Corey Booker, a Stanford alum, together with David Shaw, who's the head coach at Stanford, had a conversation about racial and social justice. So I think we know where David Shaw stands on these issues and his support for his student athletes, and his recruits know where to look on that. And then former USC head coach Pete Carroll was also on that call. So I guess that's how we can get USC in this conversation for those in the chat. But beyond that, David Shaw also talked about how his players expressed gratitude about the decision being made to postpone the season, because they knew what it meant. They knew what it meant for their families, for other people around the country. They didn't want to be in limbo, not sure if there was going to be a season played. So I think Stanford gets it. I think the people that Coach Shaw wants get it. And I've heard him talking about recruiting the other day, and how when he goes, he doesn't just go and talk to a football coach. He'll go and he'll talk to the counselors and the teachers, and he expects them to know who he's coming to look for when he comes in with Stanford on his chest, because he expects that the type of athlete and the type of person, the type of leader that would be at a school would be someone who's interested in Stanford, and that's the same type of person who understands the moral issues at play here.
That's all great. I want to address Luke's other question as well. Why didn't Stanford just dip into that multi-billion-dollar endowment and get this thing done? We talked a lot about that with the situation with Stanford cutting 11 sports, how much of a shame that was, how much of an absolute farce. Stanford athletics messaging has been based on that decision. But the endowment just seems to be something that's totally separate from athletics. And moreover, it seems like Stanford's vision as a university does not necessarily include athletics as a huge part of this university's message to the world. And I do think that is partially seen in the Pac-12 decision to not play while other conferences are playing. And medically, like I said, it makes sense. But when you just look at it from a sports point of view, it's hard to isolate sports, but let's try to do it for 1 second. You see that other places in the country, sports is more important than about anything else, and thus sports are being played. And if you're a recruit looking to come to the Pac-12, you're seeing a conference that is going to be sitting on the sidelines because they weren't willing to dip into that endowment. They weren't willing to take those risks, even if they were bad risks to take. And so the way I see it, there's no winners in this situation. The conferences that are playing are putting their communities at risk. The conferences that aren't playing are losing a season and perhaps losing their standing amongst the power conferences for a long time to come. But this has been a bit of a depressing